Hi guys, this is Connie, trying to find a place in the basement to do some more Connie's reads, because the goal is to try and finish up as much of this as possible. And I started this last year when, actually almost 2 years ago, because I had gone through a miscarriage and somebody gave this to me. Peter Chin's Blindsided by God, Disappointment, Suffering, and the Untamable Goodness of God. And we are currently on chapter 4. So, here we go. The title's called It's Cancer. My first exposure to the ravages of breast cancer was not through an experience with my family or a friend, but in traffic. It was the summer of 1999, and I was driving my 1988 Toyota Cressida from the campus to lead a Bible study for the youth group at the church I attended. The traffic was especially terrible that day, inexplicably grinding to a complete halt only a few blocks into my drive. As is my custom in such situations, I railed and pounded the steering wheel, all but certain the traffic was caused by one simple fact, that everyone in the world is a worse driver than I am, an opinion I hold to this day. But as we crept forward, I could see that the traffic wasn't caused by a driver's incompetence or an accident, but that a charity run was taking place on the road ahead of us. Brightly dressed runners crossed the intersection, many of them not necessarily running, but happily shuffling along in the painfully non-athletic way charity runners do. Their official race day t-shirts and hats were adorned with red ribbons, marking that they were running, shuffling, to raise money in the fight against HIV and AIDS. Because of this, and the fact that it was such a marvelous summer day, most of the drivers around me seemed to be remarkably good-natured about the delay. Some even clapped and shouted encouragement to the runners through their open windows, which the runners gratefully acknowledged with a cheery wave of their hands and panting, open-mouthed smiles. I myself had never been part of a charity run like this, and was touched by the attitudes on display, not only of the runners, but especially of the drivers. Drivers in Connecticut usually respond to traffic with wrath, the intensity of which would make even God raise his eyebrows in astonishment. The woman in the car next to mine was yelling out her window too, but the tone of her voice was distinctly different from the others, edged with sharpness. At first, I couldn't make out exactly what she was saying, but she was clearly upset, probably because she was in a rush to get somewhere. But out of curiosity, I listened more carefully and heard her shout, "AIDS is a preventable disease! AIDS is a preventable disease!" I was stunned. She was yelling discouragements at the people who were running the race. Disgusted and outraged, I lunged to the passenger side of my car to roll down my window and bellowed at her. "What is your problem? They're doing this for charity!" The woman spun to look at me, a shocked expression on her face, and then immediately turned and looked straight out her windshield. As if ashamed of what she had said, or maybe just that she had been caught saying it, she refused to make eye contact with me. But with a trembling voice raged both anger and sadness, she retorted, "AIDS is preventable. Breast cancer is not." And with that, she closed her window. My mind and tongue wrestled with each other for control as I tried to comprehend her logic. Why breast cancer was of such high priority to her that she felt it necessary to criticize those who supported any other cause. Initially, I assumed the worst of her. She must still hold on to the antiquated notion that AIDS was only a gay person's disease, or that AIDS victims were just suffering the consequences of their own choices. Or maybe she was one of those equally wrathful people you read about on the news, who could be driven to murderous rage by traffic, willing to end all life on earth after being cut off on the road. In that moment, there didn't seem to be any other possible explanation for someone saying something so utterly vile and so lacking in perspective. But as I continued to stare at her in disbelief, I noticed something I had not before. Her hair. Something about her hair was just not right. It appeared imbalanced in some way, as if skewed a little too far to one side. hair too thick and matted and sitting low on her brow. Speaking of her brow, she had virtually no eyebrows, except two painfully thin lines that appeared to have been clumsily painted on with eyebrow pencil. And even though her cheeks were flushed with anger and shame after our exchange, I could still tell that she was pale and gaunt. It finally hit me. This woman had breast cancer. She must have been undergoing chemotherapy and had lost all her hair, a fact she hid by wearing a wig and makeup. As this realization dawned upon me, she began to cry, tears silently streaming down her thin face. This was my first exposure to breast cancer, and what I gleaned from that brief encounter was that breast cancer must be terrible. It disfigured you, not just in body, but in heart, and transformed you into a person whose every word betrayed the terrible pain that racked both body and soul. From that moment on, the prospect of breast cancer deeply frightened me. I was relieved I would never get it, and neither would anyone I loved. Fast forward a full decade to late November of 2009. My family and I had cleared our house of all the chicken bones left by the squatters, and were quickly settling... Chicken, really? You eat chicken on Thanksgiving? Anywho. And we're quickly settling into our new life in the city, stolen clogs and all. That also meant we could finally get started with this church plant in earnest, the main reason we had moved to DC in the first place. And all initial signs pointed to this church becoming a solid success. The first sign that this was the case was not an external one, but the personal transformation that took place in me. I am not by nature a sociable person. In fact, whatever animal represents the opposite of a social butterfly, that is me. A forever scowling, butterfly-eating bird of some sort. But for those few weeks in the fall of 2009, I put my intense social awkwardness behind me and approached everyone I knew and everyone that those people knew about the church. It didn't really matter who they were or their religious background. They could have been Anglican, Pentecostal, non-denominational, Buddhist in my mind. I was just inviting them to participate in something great that God was doing in the city, and so had no reason to be embarrassed about my forwardness. To my surprise, a good number of them responded yes, that they did want to get involved. Such responses caught me off guard because I had always assumed that their answer would be no, followed by mocking laughter and finger pointing. I think I may have watched too much Charlie Brown when I was young. Eventually, the reverse began to take place, where people I barely knew were reaching out to me, asking me about our church's vision and mission. I paused, trying to remember how a vision and mission were different from one another, before deciding that it really didn't matter. I told them our church wanted to strike a balance between fostering our own personal identity as God's beloved children, as well as loving service to the surrounding community, a balance I described as being filled by God, overflowing to others. Through those conversations, I discovered that this sense of balance between identity and calling had deep resonance with people, many of whom were tired of churches focusing on one dynamic at the expense of the other, instead of seeing them as two sides of a single coin. Eventually, even clerks at grocery stores and people walking their dogs approached me to ask when and where our church met and how they could get involved. The future was bright. Just one final unexpected obstacle stood in our way, a small lump in Carol's right breast. The discovery of this lump alarmed us, but not excessively. We were optimistic it would end up being nothing serious. After all, Carol was young and healthy and had no history of breast cancer in her family. It is fairly common for women to have a benign mass in their breast tissue. And to top it off, we were doing God's good work and planting a brand new congregation in the city. It would make no sense for God to let Carol get sick now, of all times. But knowing it was better to be safe than sorry, Carol dutifully went to her doctor's office in Virginia to have a mammogram. We were all but certain the doctor would confirm that the lump was nothing to be worried about, and that would be the end of it. Much to our surprise, that is not what the doctor said. Instead, he told Carol that he did not like the look of the results and wanted her to have a biopsy to make sure everything was okay. Up to that point in our lives, both of us had been blessed with good physical health and had never heard a doctor say anything to us except, "You'll be fine, be sure to exercise and eat healthy." To hear him say something different rattled us. For the first time, I began to wonder, could that lump be something more? An unsettling feeling of anxiety crept into my thoughts, springing to life every time I laughed or otherwise tried to enjoy myself. I could be working on a sermon or playing with my daughters when suddenly I would find myself asking, could the lump be something more? I tried again and again to push this question aside, reassuring myself by using the same arguments that I had before, but to no avail. The thought stubbornly persisted. Eventually, Carol did have her biopsy and was told to come into the office in Virginia to discuss her results with a doctor. What I remember from that particular day was that I should have given her a hug before she left. I don't have a very good memory at all for details. I often wander from room to room of my house, furrowing my brow as I try to remember why I came upstairs and how inexplicably find myself in the children's bedroom. And so the exact details of the day Carol went to see the doctor about the results from her biopsy are a little vague. I don't remember what I ate, or what Carol was wearing, or the weather that morning. I do have a great memory for emotions, however. Details of an event may quickly pass out of my mind, but I always retain an accurate memory of what I was feeling at that moment. And I can usually piece things together from there. What I remember of that day was that there was a bit of tension in the air, and I'm pretty sure it was my fault. I had stayed up too late the night before playing video games. That may not sound like that big of a deal, or a cause for tension, at least for unmarried people. But married people with children know differently. Yes, we do. After a video game binge, I am a zombie for the next 24 hours and nothing but a liability at home, instead of being just the minor annoyance I typically am. Carol gets annoyed at me because of this, and as a result, I get annoyed with her that she is annoyed with me, which she finds annoying in turn, if not slightly galling. So that is all I remember from the day. She was leaving for her appointment, and things were a little tense between us. As she left, in an unnaturally stiff-toned voice, she called out, "I'm going now," and then hung there in the doorway. By her voice and delay, I knew she wanted a hug for encouragement, and I knew that I should give her that hug, along with an abject apology for being stupid and immature, but with the ridiculous self-righteousness that only the truly guilty dare possess, I didn't. To some degree, I just assumed the appointment would go well. She would come home in a few hours and everything would be back to normal. There was no need to make a big deal of this. But I did this mostly because I have this terrible habit where in the moments I know I am most wrong, I act instead as if I am most right. It's as though somehow my moral outrage alone will convince others, and perhaps even myself, that I am actually the one who has the higher ground, despite obvious signs otherwise. I have since come to realize that moral outrage has little, if anything, to do with actual morality. So even though deep in my heart I knew it was the right thing to do, I didn't give Carol her usual hug out the door. Instead, I suddenly called out, "Bye!" and that was it. She waited a moment longer, and then, without a word, she closed the door behind her. Maybe that will teach her for making me feel bad for doing something I shouldn't have been doing. For the next few hours, I tried to further convince myself of the rightness of my cause. That I was a grown man who worked hard for God and for his family and deserved a video game binge here and there. Who is she to tell me what to do, like I was a child? But it was no use. Even in the twisted gravity of my mind, all the justifications fell flat, and I had to finally admit that I had screwed up royally, so I resolved to apologize to Carol at the first possible opportunity. As soon as she came home, I would give her that hug, plus an apology. Almost as if on cue, Carol called me on the phone right then. I opened my mouth to apologize to her, but I never got the chance, because as soon as I answered, in a shattered voice that I had never heard from my wife before, Carol sobbed, "Peter, it's cancer. It's cancer." At first, I ridiculously thought she was playing a joke on me, just saying that to get back at me for my behavior earlier that day. But she would never be so cruel. That convinced me, or what convinced me was her voice. I'll never forget that voice. It lacked all of the restraint that we normally subconsciously impose on our way of speaking. It was wild, hysterical, and unnerving. A voice a person never consciously uses but instead issues forth from some deep and terrible place. like when someone falls from a great height. It is the voice of terror, of mourning, of a broken heart. And with that voice, Carol told me the doctor had confirmed it was breast cancer, a particularly aggressive kind, and that she would need treatment right away. It was as if a bomb went off at that moment, sucking all the air out of the room, the word becoming a silent, enormous vacuum. I, a pastor with great facility with words, who had preached endless sermons for endless numbers of people, could not find a single word for my own wife. But truly there was no trite word I could have thrown into that void to make Carol or me feel better. All I could bring myself to say in that moment was that she should come home as soon as possible. But I knew this for a fact. What would have made that one moment many times easier for my wife to bear was if she had not traveled to her doctor with the sense that her husband was upset at her for something that he himself had done wrong, but instead had received a sincere apology and a loving hug. I've learned since then that there are situations in life in which your response is not correctly measured by what you say after something has happened, but by what you said and did before. Because sometimes something so terrible and shocking occurs that any words of comfort and encouragement you give in response will fall miserably short, and you must depend on the emotional cachet you have accumulated before that. Or cachet. Don't know the words anymore. And God help you if you have none. That was a hard lesson that I learned that day. That being a good husband means not just being there after bad news, but before as well. An hour later, Carol came through the front door, and the face she wore broke my heart. Her eyes, usually so luminous and bright, were nothing more than pools of undiluted sadness, hidden under brows contorted with fear. Her tear-stained cheeks were slack, as were her shoulders, both exhausted from crying. Filled with both shame and love, with leaden arms, I reached out to her and finally gave her that hug that she had wanted earlier, but now in a totally different context. Now I wasn't hugging her to apologize for playing video games too late into the night. I was hugging her to keep our world from falling apart. I'm way too sensitive for these books. With tears streaming down both of our faces, we stood and clutched each other desperately, as we would for months afterward. To this day, I have never missed an opportunity to give my wife a hug. You never know what will happen to those you love when they walk out the door. This is a ridiculously long chapter. These chapters just keep getting longer and longer. I need new books. Carol and I didn't talk much in the days that followed her diagnosis, choosing instead to sit quietly for long periods, and breaking the silence only to ask each other questions to which neither of us had anything close to an answer. How are we going to tell the kids about this? Carol asked me, her voice tinged with dread and no wonder. Katie had just turned two the month before, and her older sister 4 only 1 day later. They were both still too young, nothing more than a little girl and a toddler. How could they process the news that their mother was sick? What would the word cancer mean to them? How could we prepare them for the changes that they would soon witness? The mastectomy, then chemotherapy. Would we also have to tell them about death? One afternoon, we finally mustered up the courage to tell them the news. Carol started. Sophia, Katie, come here. They came over to her like they always did, like little ducks taking shelter beneath her arms and nestling close. Mommy is very sick right now. I know she looks okay, but there's something in her body that is no good for her, and we have to get it out and make it go away, and the doctors are going to help us do that. They looked up at her silently, not really understanding what she was saying, only knowing by the tone of her voice and by her tears that what she shared was grave. I continued, Mommy is going to go through a lot of changes soon, but she is going to be the same Mommy, and she's going to be much better after all this. So you need to help Mommy and Daddy by being good girls and by praying every day that she will get better. After a moment of silence, Sophia looked at me and asked, "What does she have, Daddy?" For a second I hesitated, debating on whether or not I should use that loaded word that always brings so much dread in its wake. Cancer. But I decided that even if I didn't tell her exactly what it was, she would inevitably see its effects on her mother and on our lives. The doctor visits, the surgery, the physical and emotional burden Carol would endure. We might as well give her a word to attach to the reality that we now faced. And so I answered her gently. "Cancer, Sophia. It's called breast cancer." I could tell by her expression that she had never heard that term before. But she would hear it many more times in the coming months. There was nothing more that we could share with them at that point. Nothing that they could understand or would be at all helpful. All that was left for us to do was to hold hands together and pray. Pray that God would heal Mommy and protect all of our family. Next, I had to tell our church. At that time, our church met on the 3rd floor of an august former embassy building in Columbia Heights. The room was surrounded by large windows, which gave us a full view of the bustling streets and sidewalks of the neighborhood and the old church buildings that sat on nearly every street corner. That Sunday, 25 bright-eyed young adults sat in their seats, chatting cheerfully with one another and waiting to hear what God had planned for the next for our church. Looking into their faces, I could hardly bring myself to break the news to them of Carol's diagnosis and the details that we had so far, which were few. After telling them what we knew, I also let them know that over the next few weeks I would be consulting with mentors in the denomination to figure out if it was still a good idea to continue on with our church or if it was better to close it down. They were speechless, their faces stricken. As young people, they had no idea how to react to this news, as it was so rare for someone in our age group to get cancer. But it was not only their youthfulness that made this news difficult to process. It was also the fact that Carol's diagnosis stood in stark contrast to everything we had experienced up to that point. Our first few weeks and months as a church were filled with such remarkable promise, replete with what seemed like divine signs from God that this church was going to thrive. After those experiences, it was jarring for us to learn of Carol's diagnosis, like suddenly hitting a brick wall while doing 70 miles an hour on the highway. I knew that they were asking the same question I was. Why God had allowed such a devastating thing to happen at such a promising point in our church's life. But that was a question that none of us could answer. As we did with Sophia and Katie, we closed our time by praying together, asking God for healing, comfort, and strength to endure the coming months. I did a lot of praying on my own as well, more than I had ever prayed in my entire life. I prayed the first thing when I woke up. Oh, I got that sentence selection wrong. I prayed the first thing when I woke up. I would pray constantly throughout the day and before I slept. And the refrain for all those times was the same. God, please heal Carol, please. I would wake up repeatedly in the middle of the night with one thought in prayer on my mind. God, heal my wife, before drifting back off to sleep. Prayer was a place of solace, a place I could bring my burdens and troubles and find some measure of comfort. But an unexpected, unwelcome emotion began encroaching into this refuge. Betrayal. I began to feel betrayed by God. My prayers might begin, God, again, I ask you for healing for Carol and strength to persevere. But eventually, inevitably, deeper thoughts would follow. But this wasn't supposed to happen, you know. This isn't right. Not for me and my family. Not to Carol. Because God knew I had been a good person, or tried to be. I had devoted my entire life to following and serving God, giving up a promising career in medicine to become a pastor. And I wasn't satisfied with just being in ministry, but wanted to do great things for the sake of God. So I started up my own church. I was willing to live in a hard neighborhood, a place where my possessions and my family were often at risk. As a result, God was supposed to protect me and my family against the worst that the world had to offer. But he didn't. He had broken his side of the promise and allowed my third child to be miscarried. He had permitted my house to get broken into, our home violated. He had let my wife get breast cancer right as we were planting a church. This kind of thing wasn't supposed to happen to people who followed God. We were supposed to enjoy protection and blessing, not cancer. This was just so unfair. I felt betrayed by God because he had broken his promises. Being a mature Christian and pastor, I tried my best to fend off this feeling. I reminded myself that I knew better, and that there are no such promises in Scripture that a good life guarantees a lack of suffering. After all, Jesus obeyed his Father's will, but was persecuted and suffered terribly. The disciples followed in the footsteps of their Lord and experienced the same. It says it point blank in 1 Peter 4:12. Do not be surprised at the fiery ordeal that has come on you to test you, as though something strange were happening to you. God never promised us a life free from trial and hardship, and I knew that. I had learned that in seminary, and had often preached that exact same message to others on many occasions. And yet, despite the Apostle Peter's words, despite all my good theology and good intentions, here I was, my prayer life infiltrated by the deep sense of betrayal I felt toward God. I realized then that although I had never consciously subscribed to the gospel of health and wealth, the ideology that following God ensured physical blessings must have subconsciously absorbed it. Some subtle form of it had worked itself into my heart and mind, and from countless sources. I had absorbed it from the pervasive culture of the American dream, which teaches us that everyone gets what they deserve, that those who work hard can expect a successful life. If you do not have a successful life, well, you have only yourself to blame. I had inherited this mentality from my parents, who believed that their children's success would prevent them from suffering in the same way they had. This ideology that seeped into my mind through the media and through countless books, TV shows, and movies, where the good guy always gets the girl and the bad guy gets his just desserts. Without my knowledge, and contrary to the word, I had absorbed these beliefs into my very core. But I had never before realized how deeply I subscribed to these ideas until Carol was diagnosed. It was as if that moment separated what I said I believed from what I truly believe, and the gap between the two was larger than I had ever thought possible. That is one of the powerful effects of true suffering. It shakes you with such brute force that your true thoughts and true beliefs are laid bare, and anything to which you simply paid lip service goes flying by the wayside, unable to hold fast in the face of such turmoil. Emotionally, I felt betrayed by God, but I was forced to confront the fact that he had never promised that we would never suffer, and it was hardly fair to keep God accountable to promises that he never made. God had not betrayed me, and neither had his word. In truth, of all the influences in my life, it was God and his word that had tried to prepare me for the possibility of suffering, or rather, the inevitability. What had betrayed me were my modern and privileged sensibilities, which were obsessed with keeping suffering at arm's length, and my diluted and selfish understanding of faith, which equated hard times with an absent or unloving God. It was they that had misled me and left me brutally unprepared for Carol's diagnosis, not God. But God does make promises to us, although of a very different sort than we often imagine. This is what we are told in Isaiah 43, 1-3. But now, this is what the Lord says. He who created you, Jacob, he who formed you, Israel, do not fear, for I have redeemed you. I have summoned you by name. You are mine. When you pass through the waters, I will be with you. And when you pass through the rivers, they will not sweep over you. When you walk through fire, you will not be burned. The flames will not set you ablaze. There is a promise in this passage, but not the one that we think. It is not a promise that we will never suffer. In fact, the passage seems to imply that we will inevitably pass through river, water, and fire. But the promise that God makes is that when we do, he will be with us, and those waters will not overwhelm us, nor will the fire completely consume and set us ablaze. He does not promise that we will not suffer, but that when we do suffer, he will be there with us in the midst of it all. It is a promise not of painlessness, but of his presence. Psalm 23, that famous passage of all comfort and encouragement, testifies to the same exact promise. In verse 4 it reads, "Even though I walk through the darkest valley, I will fear no evil, for you are with me, your rod and your staff, they comfort me." We often overlook this, but God does not promise that we will not see the valley of the worst, the valley of mourning and persecution and cancer, only that when we do, he will be right there next to us. His rod and staff, which are the hallmarks of his presence, will comfort and encourage us. God had never told me that we would never see this valley or walk this path. And in fact, the valley was only to get much darker in the coming weeks. He only promised that when I saw that terrible place, he would be there and would never abandon me. While I found real comfort in this, only time would tell whether he would be faithful to that promise or not. Whew. And that is the end of chapter 4. If that's not timely, I don't know what is. But be careful with that and enjoy, please and thank you. And I will see you in the next installment. Have a great one. Bye.